The air inside the clan's once familiar house felt as if it had been vacuumed out of the somber wooden walls, where every smiling family portrait still hung like a promise that order, history, and honor would never fracture. But it was precisely that heavy silence that betrayed the change. Anita noticed Vernon's gait had shifted. His breath shortened whenever the phone rang, his gaze drifting somewhere else before returning with the courteous smile that had soothed her for years. She told herself she wasn't the sort to let suspicion govern her mind, wasn't someone who would drop her dignity into the rumor mill the nosy press spun outside their gates. Yet the ramparts she had built over years, through discipline and faith, began to weaken, thin, and finally tear. Not because of midnight calls or a wrinkled shirt, but because of an intuition that rarely failed her. Something larger, deeper, longer smoldering than tawdry gossip about infidelity was growing, according to its own design, like a tumor fed by silence. Vernon often said, with a patriarch's composure, that every storm passes if one holds to standards and knows how to wait. It was true in his life of commerce, true of the battles before the board, true of the backroom election seasons full of stratagems, true even of times of mourning when a loved one fell and the funeral itself became a contest of wits. But this storm wasn't advancing from the outside. It lived in those brief moments when he stared at his phone too long, in the odd decision to leave the estate on an unscheduled afternoon. He knew he was lighting a fuse to a war unlike any he had fought, because the enemy wasn't an old rival or a cunning stakeholder, but the past, the unspoken word, a moral debt that had been quietly compounding with the years. The door of the old cafe shut behind him, leaving the damp scent of wood and the bright whir of the grinder ticking like a pestle-beating memory. The woman across from him didn't need to speak to summon back the radiant years and the practiced evasions. Sharon wasn't a sweet ghost from long ago, nor a romantic temptation. She was the mirror fate set before him, forcing him to look at what he had once chosen not to see. Many years earlier, when auditoriums still blazed with light and the performance calendar wound into the family's political schedule like two faces of the same coin, a mistake had happened, and it was handled in the swiftest, most discreet way. Bury it in the grown-up silence. Now that silence had become evidence against him, because what adults cover up always finds a way back through the eyes of the young. The small photograph on the table sliced through every attempt at self-justification like a pair of shears. A young woman's face, her eyes bearing a disquieting familiarity, features assembled as if from his own memory, conjuring a parallel timeline where he had never been there to be a father. The name June touched the softest part of the map of his choices, where decisions forked and created different lives for the same man. Vernon felt the carefully arranged days of his righteousness tilt, because there was a truth he had never dared place on the table with all the other values. Who would pay the price for silence kept too long? He left the cafe like a man just finishing surgery without anesthesia. Every step a clumsily stitched vein, liable to leak at any moment. Anita didn't need a confession to know Vernon's study had turned into a trench. She crossed its threshold late at night only to catch the scent of freshly printed paper, to see shadow directories, appointments encoded under ordinary names. In a dim corner, an old articulette photograph lay there like a cruel joke of cosmic order. Youth may not know how to lie, but the collective history of any group has a gray zone even backstage cameras can't reach. Anita recognized what she had tried to deny. Many things had begun long before she was ready to face them. Bonds forged for honor and family had become a trap when used only to bind fear. As another call radiated from the far side of the city, the pieces began to topple. Sharon didn't speak to wound. She spoke because a young person needed to know their roots and because the remaining adults couldn't keep living as if cause and effect lacked a memory. Naomi received the information like someone handed a map missing an entire forest. In an instant, every speculation about lineage, every whisper from standing room cocktail hours rang out like shattering glass skittering over stone. Regina, seasoned by countless darkroom negotiations, scented that the upheaval would not stop at any one family. Any fracture in the Hamilton Dupree legacy would call forth forces eager to crowd in. Power doesn't resent a vacuum. It hungers for one. The paradox was that while the media delighted in the prospect of an affair, the real battle inside was about facing the consequences of a secret not tied to momentary desire, but to neglected responsibility. Vernon understood that if he announced it at dinner, in his old calm baritone, he would turn confession into a PR tactic. The kernel of the tragedy would be swapped for a salvaging spectacle. He didn't want that, but his hesitation was itself another decision, a selfish one disguised as the need for more time to set things in order. Time, once his ally in business, here was a co-conspirator in costume, because each passing day hollowed Anita's heart a little more and eroded the chance for June to enter his life with honor. Anita began to investigate the way a woman does who has weathered hundreds of public storms. No theatrics, no displays of power, only quiet record-keeping. She gathered calendars around rehearsal hours, pulled up the invoices for musical services Vernon hadn't yet purged from the system, cross-checked Sharon's number with those golf buddy calls that lasted longer than a summer downpour. She wasn't seeking proof to stage a jealous scene. She sought answers to locate her self-respect within a new picture about to emerge. What terrified her was not the possibility of being betrayed by a man, but the possibility of being betrayed by their shared history, by the belief that everything had always been clear and clean. Meanwhile, Naomi stood amid equations of obligation no family codebook teaches. If June truly ran in the Dupree bloodline, every inheritance structure, every equilibrium agreement built on earlier assumptions would have to be re-examined. The door to legal review opened at the same moment as the door to personal hurt. She knew each decision she made would be interpreted as a political move, even if it arose from wanting to return the truth to a young person. Regina, with instincts that wasted nothing, sketched scenarios at once. Who could exploit the tremor? Who would swarm the Hamilton-Dupree weakness? Who would approach with a polite smile and contract-stained hands? The market in power never sleeps, and the scent of blood from a budding secret is perfume to predators. Sharon wore the composure of someone who chose to fight on the grounds of truth, but no one wages such a fight without paying. She knew behind her marched a formation of judging looks, whispers backstage that she was breaking a family for some hazy claim. She knew she was colliding with a wall named Anita, the woman who didn't need to raise her voice to make everyone understand that honor is the only real asset. And yet, in this story, her adversary wasn't Anita, but the tendency to shift pain onto the next generation. If a young person is standing at the crossroads of name and legacy, the only thing grown-ups are not permitted to do is demand they wait another 10 years. Vernon drafted a plan as usual, but this time no timeline obeyed orders. He tried to sketch a path to disclosure. Anita first, then the extended family, then the board, and last the press with a cooling statement. The road looked straight, but the ground beneath, it was mined. Each step risked forfeiting the hard-won peace he had believed he'd purchased with decades of guarding the family, and it also risked tossing June into the storm's eye. In these stories, the young are always branded as instruments of the old. He wanted to avoid everything, and that desire dragged him into a dark gridlock where every delay looked ethical, while only deepening the betrayal. Anita didn't wait for him to pick an auspicious hour. She walked straight into the truth the way a housekeeper of storms does, clearing passages, bracing beams, calculating worst-case scenarios. She called an attorney not to prepare a divorce but to ask about testing protocols, about clauses shielding a young person from media reprisal, about ways to restructure the family trust, so a late acceptance wouldn't become a fire sale of honor. She contacted a trusted family physician, not to make noise, but to standardize procedure. Meanwhile, she allowed herself to imagine everything that could collapse. The year-end dinner, the commemorations, the grandchildren's laughter, the philanthropic plans. One of the most ruthless skills of anyone who has ever helmed a family is learning to stare at the worst case until fear no longer paralyzes. Around them, the community inhaled the tabloid scent of an affair. It is the easiest way to digest what lies outside the vital arteries of a great household. But the truth was harsher and colder. This was an overdue responsibility. And like any debt pushed too far past due, the penalties are so steep one longs to pin them on someone else. Some would point at Sharon, others at Vernon. The shrewder would point at Anita, claiming she hadn't been sensitive enough to sense it. Every pointing finger was a needle pressing into the last thin skin of their shared life. Yet a family is not a crime scene for social opinion to shoot fireworks across. A family is where one must tell apart the wound to be protected from the wound to be exposed for healing. Here the two coexisted, straining like opposite ends of a rope in a tug-of-war no one is allowed to drop. On the day the wall of silence threatened to fall, it didn't rain. Sun pooled gold across the wood. The vases sat exactly where they belonged. Not a single rose petal astray. It was that normalcy that made everything ceremonial, as if the universe had hung a backdrop for a rending that must proceed without anyone playing the cheap victim. Vernon entered the sitting room with the face of a man who no longer had time to change the script. Anita looked at him and understood that the moment he wanted to choose had arrived. But the leading man could no longer speak the lines he'd written. She didn't need to interrogate him to begin the only thing she believed was decent, opening the door for a young person to step into her own story, even if it meant an old world would never return. Elsewhere, Naomi set her pen to a document that would launch the purest legal procedure she could design, with confidentiality clauses tight enough that anyone wishing to exploit them would risk burning their own hands. Regina called a closed door meeting not to orchestrate a strike, but to draw boundaries. Where is the line between protecting a legacy and corrupting power in its name? Sharon sat in the old room, her palm on the photograph that had captured a fragment of history, understanding that everyone was passing through a narrow tunnel where the light at its end was so far off it could be mistaken for a mirage. And June, the unwilling eye of the storm, was learning to breathe in air thicker than water. She was the embodiment of the unspoken question the adults had been ducking for years. When a truth is buried under a grave of honor, who will dig it up and who will take responsibility for restoring it to its rightful place on the family tree? She was neither a ballot nor a tile in some statistical mosaic of power. She was the reminder that everything the elders erect in the name of dignity is meaningless without the courage to face the truth at the most uncomfortable moment. The anger in Anita didn't crack like thunder. It burned like a hearth fire, keeping heat without consuming the house. She allowed herself pain but forbade herself ruin. She knew that if she turned everything into a verdict, she would lose the power to be the one who extends a hand so the one behind can step over the threshold. But she also knew that if she turned everything into a philosophy lesson, she would betray the blood in her veins, the blood that built this family through hard choices. The hardest thing is neither to forgive nor to punish, but to stand on that knife edge and choose the right means, the right moment, the right language. Facing the host of invisible eyes demanding justice, Vernon finally understood that no communications roadmap can save a man who failed to be truthful with the woman who had weathered half a lifetime of storms by his side. He grasped that the essence of his betrayal wasn't simply concealing a meeting, but hiding a part of himself that should have belonged to the family. When truth is postponed, it doesn't wait quietly for a convenient day. It goes and finds allies in others' doubts, befriends conjecture, hires the media's hands, and by the time it returns, it is no longer pure. He had allowed that to happen, and now he had to face a version of the truth polluted by time and fear. In conference rooms where donors and partners tally risk, the news of an unexpected branch in the lineage spread like an oil slick across glass. Hard to wipe away, easy to see, forever pointed at. They would ask who guaranteed continuity of the legacy, who held the keys to the vault, who signed the named endowments. Practical questions, it seemed, but they pressed at the root of the tragedy. How much in this life is erected to shield a name rather than to protect a person? And when forced to choose between the two, which family is brave enough to choose the person first? Night closed on an uneasy silence. On the dark wooden table, the envelopes for testing lay beside legal documents awaiting signatures, while the old articulate frame tilted as if about to fall. The adults stood around it like sentries around a monument. Some wishing to preserve, some to relocate, some to touch it to be sure it was still real. But the most real thing now wasn't the wood, nor the name etched on brass, but a single question germinating at once in three hearts, in his, in hers, and in the one who had forced them to revisit what they thought lost. If that door opens and those young footsteps cross the threshold, who will be brave enough to look straight into those eyes first without bowing their head in shame, and will it happen in time, before legacy hardens into a prison for those who poured so much of themselves into building it?